The smallest gift you ever give a stranger may become the day an entire galaxy remembers your name. Ethan Carter had stopped expecting anyone to remember his birthday years ago. At 28, birthdays had become little more than another square on the calendar, another overnight shift beneath artificial lights that never dimmed and clocks that never seemed to move. The corridors of Starlight Interstellar Medical Center glowed with the same pale white illumination they wore every hour of every day, making midnight feel exactly like noon. The air carried the familiar scent of disinfectant mixed with recycled oxygen, while quiet ventilation systems whispered through the ceilings with mechanical precision. Somewhere beyond the reinforced glass walls, transport shuttles drifted between docking platforms like slow-moving stars, their navigation lights blinking against the endless darkness of space. Ethan adjusted the navy blue sleeve of his medical assistant uniform as he stepped away from the supply station, balancing a small white cardboard box in one hand. Inside rested a modest slice of chocolate cake topped with a single candle that had never been lit. He had bought it 20 minutes earlier from an aging vending kiosk near the employee lounge after noticing a discount notification flashing across its cracked display. "Happy birthday, Ethan," the machine had chirped in its cheerful synthetic voice after scanning his employee profile. It was the first birthday greeting he had received all day. He had laughed quietly, thanked a machine that couldn't hear him, and continued walking. It wasn't a sad life, he often reminded himself. Just a quiet one. Most of his co-workers were busy with emergencies arriving from nearby colonies. His parents had passed away several years before. The few friends he still kept in touch with lived light years away, their schedules scattered across different planetary time zones. Birthdays simply became another ordinary shift when adulthood stretched long enough. He wasn't bitter about it. He had patients to care for, medications to deliver, paperwork to finish before sunrise. Life had a way of moving forward whether anyone celebrated or not. He turned into Corridor C, the pediatric recovery wing reserved for visitors from allied worlds. The hallway was unusually silent. Even the monitors seemed to beep more softly here, respecting the fragile peace behind each closed door. Decorative holographic stars floated lazily along the ceiling, projecting gentle blue constellations meant to comfort frightened children recovering far from home. Ethan smiled faintly at the display. Someone had programmed a shooting star to cross the ceiling every 30 seconds. A nice touch. Then he heard it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just a quiet sound that almost disappeared beneath the ventilation system. Someone was crying. Ethan slowed his steps. The sound came again, gentle enough that another person might have mistaken it for the humming machinery. He followed it until he reached a narrow, waiting alcove tucked beside a panoramic observation window overlooking Earth. There, sitting alone on a bench beneath the soft glow of the stars, was a young, alien woman. She looked about his age. Her skin was astonishingly pale, almost porcelain beneath the silver-blue lighting. Long white hair fell over her shoulders, hiding much of her face as she stared down at her folded hands. Her simple, gray travel jacket suggested she wasn't wealthy, and a visitor identification band around her wrist blinked with temporary clearance codes. She wasn't making any effort to wipe away the tears slipping silently onto her sleeves. She simply sat there, completely still, as though the universe had become too heavy to carry. Ethan glanced toward the nearby nurse's station. Empty. Whatever had happened, she was facing it alone. He looked down at the small cake in his hand. For a brief second, he considered continuing toward the break room. It was only one slice of cake. It wasn't much. Besides, she was a stranger. Maybe she wanted privacy. Maybe someone else would come. But nobody came. 30 seconds passed. Then another shooting star drifted across the ceiling, casting a brief shimmer across the observation window. Ethan let out a slow breath, walked toward the bench, and stopped a respectful few feet away. The young woman looked up, surprised to find someone standing there. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat. Hers carried the exhausted emptiness of someone who had cried long enough to run out of words. Ethan offered the smallest smile he could manage. Without asking questions, Without introducing himself, without pretending he understood whatever pain had brought her there, he gently placed the unopened birthday cake on an empty space beside her. "Looks like," he said softly, "today could use a little more cake than I could." The young woman stared at the small white box, as though it contained something far more mysterious than dessert. Her pale fingers rested on her lap without moving, and for several long seconds the only sound between them was the steady rhythm of the hospital ventilation and the distant chime of an arriving shuttle somewhere beyond the observation glass. Ethan remained standing a respectful distance away, giving her every opportunity to ignore him. Instead, she slowly lifted her eyes toward him again. They were an unusual shade of silver with faint blue rings circling each iris, beautiful only because they looked painfully honest. "It is your birthday," she said quietly after noticing the printed greeting on the side of the box. Her English carried only the slightest musical accent. Ethan shrugged with an easy smile. "For another 40 minutes, according to the clock." She looked back down at the cake. "Then you should eat it." "Maybe." He slipped his hands into his pockets. "Or maybe birthdays are better when somebody else smiles too." She seemed confused by the answer. "Your celebration would become smaller." Ethan chuckled softly. "That depends on how you measure it." Another silence settled between them, but this one felt lighter than before. Finally, she reached toward the box with careful hands, almost afraid she might not deserve to touch it. She opened the lid slowly. The chocolate frosting had shifted slightly during the walk across the hospital, leaving a crooked swirl along one edge. The single unlit candle rested beside the slice instead of standing upright. It was far from perfect. Somehow that made it feel more genuine. The young woman studied it with quiet fascination. "I have seen cakes before," she whispered, "but never one that belonged to someone else." Ethan leaned lightly against the nearby wall. "Then I guess today is full of firsts." She looked at him again, uncertainty softening the sadness in her expression. Why are humans comfortable giving away happy moments? The question surprised him. He had expected polite thanks, maybe an awkward refusal. Instead, she sounded sincerely curious. Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "Because happiness usually gets bigger when somebody shares it." She repeated the sentence almost to herself, as though committing every word to memory. "Happiness gets bigger." Then, after another pause, she picked up the small plastic fork resting inside the box. She cut the tiniest piece imaginable and tasted it. Her eyes widened immediately. Ethan laughed. "Good." She nodded once. "Very good." Then she looked almost embarrassed. "It is sweeter than I expected. Chocolate usually is." She shook her head gently. "Not the cake." Ethan noticed the corners of her mouth lift for the first time. It was not a full smile, more like someone remembering they had once known how to smile. Even that tiny change seemed to brighten the cold corridor. Above them, another holographic shooting star drifted across the ceiling, scattering soft blue light over the polished floor. She watched it pass before speaking again. "My name is Lyra." "Nice to meet you, Lyra." "I am Ethan." She nodded politely. "Thank you, Ethan." He could have left then. His shift still had hours remaining, and medication deliveries would not organize themselves. Yet something about the loneliness sitting beside her felt strangely familiar. Not identical, just recognizable. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked gently. Lyra lowered her eyes toward the cake again. "My mother." Her voice became almost weightless. "She was admitted 3 hours ago after collapsing during our transport from the outer colonies." Ethan listened without interrupting. "The physicians are still examining her." She swallowed carefully. "They asked me to wait outside because family members often become anxious during emergency evaluations." A faint, apologetic smile crossed her face. "I believe they were correct." Ethan nodded with quiet understanding. Waiting is sometimes the hardest part. She folded the tiny plastic fork between her fingers. "Where I come from, families stay together through every medical procedure. Sitting outside alone feels..." She searched for the right word. "Cold." Ethan looked around the nearly empty hallway. The bright lights, spotless walls, polished floors, and humming machines suddenly felt less comforting than they usually did. Hospitals were built to heal bodies, but loneliness often slipped through every automatic door. Without saying anything else, he walked to the nearby employee refreshment station, filled 2 paper cups with hot chocolate, and returned a minute later. He handed one to Lyra before taking a seat on the opposite end of the bench. Neither of them spoke for a while. They simply watched Earth turning silently beyond the observation window, sharing warm drinks and one slightly crooked birthday cake, while the enormous hospital continued breathing around them. And for the first time that entire day, Ethan no longer felt like he was spending his birthday alone. The hospital clock above the corridor quietly shifted to 12 midnight, and somewhere inside the building a gentle electronic melody announced the beginning of a new day. Ethan glanced toward the display, smiled to himself, and took another sip of the hot chocolate that had already begun to cool. "Well," he said with a light laugh, "my birthday is officially over." Lyra looked at him with genuine surprise. "Does that disappoint you?" Ethan shook his head. "Not really. It turned out better than I expected." She lowered her eyes toward the nearly empty cake box resting between them. Only a few crumbs remained beside the candle that had never been lit. "Because you shared it?" she asked. "Because I did not spend it completely alone." The words settled gently into the quiet space between them. Lyra wrapped both hands around her paper cup, letting the warmth spread through her fingers. "My people do not celebrate birthdays," she admitted after a long pause. "We record the day we are born, but it is treated as information, not as a celebration. There are no cakes, no candes, no gatherings." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Really?" She nodded. "Our culture believes every day should have equal value. Choosing one day to celebrate a single life is considered unnecessary." She searched for the right word before adding, "perhaps even inefficient." Ethan smiled. Humans are not always very efficient. That earned a tiny laugh from her, the first genuine one since they had met. It lasted only a second, but the sound transformed the hallway more effectively than any decorative lighting could have managed. Ethan leaned back against the bench and looked through the enormous observation window. Earth rotated peacefully beneath them, wrapped in drifting clouds that glowed beneath the distant sunrise beginning to reach one side of the planet. "You know," he said quietly, "when I was a kid, my mom used to tell me birthdays were not really about getting older." Lyra turned toward him with quiet curiosity. "Then what were they about?" She said birthdays were reminders that the world became a little different the day you arrived. She believed everybody should spend at least one day each year making somebody else's world a little better. Lyra remained silent, absorbing every word. "Did you believe her?" she finally asked. Ethan laughed softly. "I was 8 years old. I mostly believed birthdays were about ice cream." She smiled again, this time without hesitation. "But later," he looked down at the empty cake box. "Later I realized she was probably right." Their conversation was interrupted by the quiet sound of approaching footsteps. An elderly maintenance worker slowly pushed a cleaning cart across the polished floor, offering Ethan a friendly nod before continuing toward the far elevators. Ethan greeted him with an easy wave. The man smiled back, then disappeared around the corner without saying a word. Lyra watched the exchange with interest. "You know everyone here?" "Not everyone." Ethan shrugged, "but enough people to say hello. Even someone cleaning the floors?" Ethan looked surprised by the question. "Especially someone cleaning the floors. Hospitals only work because every person here matters." Lyra considered that answer for several thoughtful seconds. "Among my people," she said quietly, "status determines who receives attention first." Ethan looked at her. "And do you think that is fair?" She stared into the chocolate still swirling inside her cup. "Until tonight, I never questioned it." The silence that followed felt different from the earlier ones. It no longer carried loneliness. Instead, it felt like two strangers slowly discovering that their worlds were built upon entirely different ideas. A nearby door slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. A physician wearing a silver diagnostic coat stepped into the corridor and studied a handheld medical tablet before looking around the waiting area. "Miss Lyra," he called gently. She stood so quickly that the empty paper cup nearly slipped from her hands. Hope and fear appeared together across her face. Ethan rose as well, but remained beside the bench, allowing the moment to belong entirely to her. The physician approached with a calm expression that revealed very little. "Your mother has been stabilized," he said. "She is resting comfortably. She is asking to see you." Relief washed over Lyra, so suddenly that she closed her eyes for a brief moment before taking a slow, steady breath. When she opened them again, they shimmered with grateful tears instead of frightened ones. She turned toward Ethan, searching for words that seemed impossible to find. Finally, she reached into the pocket of her simple gray jacket and removed a small silver pendant shaped like a tiny star surrounded by delicate circles. She placed it carefully into his hand and gently folded his fingers around it. "Please keep this," she whispered. Ethan immediately shook his head. "Lyra, you do not have to give me anything." She smiled with quiet certainty. "It is not payment. It is so I never forget the first person who celebrated my existence, even though it was not my birthday." The silver pendant remained warm in Ethan's palm long after Lyra disappeared through the sliding doors of the intensive care wing. He stood alone beneath the quiet glow of the corridor lights, turning the tiny star between his fingers until the delicate circles caught the soft blue reflections from the observation window. It was unexpectedly heavy for something so small, crafted with remarkable precision, but he assumed it was simply a family keepsake. After a moment, he slipped it carefully into the inside pocket of his uniform before returning to work. The hospital slowly awakened as the night drifted toward morning. Nurses exchanged reports at the central station. Fresh coffee filled the employee lounge with its familiar aroma. Service robots polished the spotless floors while supply drones floated silently overhead, carrying medication containers from one department to another. Ethan moved through his routine with practiced efficiency, checking recovery charts, delivering diagnostic tablets, answering visitor questions, and offering encouraging smiles whenever worried families needed one. By 8 o'clock that morning, the quiet birthday had already begun to feel like a distant memory. 3 days passed, then 4. Every evening Ethan found himself glancing toward Corridor C without quite realizing he was doing it. Sometimes the bench beneath the observation window sat empty. Sometimes another family occupied it, waiting through difficult hours together. He never saw Lyra again. He hoped that Mentor Mother was recovering. Hospitals had a pleasant habit of making people disappear for good reasons. On the 5th afternoon, Ethan was sorting patient files when a financial notification flashed across the employee terminal. Outstanding account balance. Pediatric Recovery Unit. He almost ignored it. Billing was not part of his responsibilities. Then one small note attached to the record caught his attention. Visitor from Outer Colony Transit Program. Treatment extension pending financial approval. The family name listed on the file was Valus. Ethan recognized it immediately. He hesitated only a second before opening the public portion of the record. The details were limited, but one number stood out with uncomfortable clarity. The remaining balance exceeded 23,000 credits. Without payment, specialized rehabilitation treatments could not continue beyond the current authorization period. Ethan quietly closed the file. He stared at the blank monitor for several seconds while conversations continued around him. Nobody else seemed to notice. Nobody else even knew the family. He remembered Lyra's exhausted smile, the way she had examined an ordinary slice of chocolate cake as though it were something extraordinary, and the relief in her eyes when she learned her mother would live. He also remembered how carefully she had folded her empty cup before throwing it away, almost apologizing for taking up space in a hospital that did not belong to her. That evening, after finishing his shift, Ethan rode the elevator down to the public transit level instead of heading home. The city stretched beyond the station in layers of glass towers reflecting the orange colors of sunset. He walked 6 blocks through the cool evening air until he reached a small neighborhood shop with a faded wooden sign that read Carter Antiques and Collectibles. The elderly owner looked up from behind the counter and smiled with recognition. "It has been a while, Ethan." Ethan returned the smile and carefully removed a polished wooden presentation case from his backpack. Inside rested an old mechanical wristwatch with a worn leather band and tiny scratches covering its silver frame. It no longer kept perfect time, but his father had worn it every day for nearly 30 years before passing it down. The owner examined it gently, without speaking. "I never thought you would sell this one," he finally said. Ethan looked at the familiar watch for one last moment. "Neither did I." "Are you certain?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Some things remind us of the people we love." He closed the case himself before placing it back on the counter. "Other things let us honor what they taught us." The shop owner studied him quietly, then opened the register without asking another question. An hour later, Ethan returned to Starlight Interstellar Medical Center, carrying nothing except a payment receipt folded neatly inside his jacket pocket. He stopped by the anonymous donation terminal in the main lobby, entered the account number from memory, transferred every credit he had just received, and selected the smallest option available, where the system asked for donor identification. The confirmation screen glowed softly for a few seconds before displaying a single sentence. "Payment accepted. Rehabilitation authorization extended." Ethan smiled to himself, folded the receipt into his pocket, and walked back toward the employee exit. He never noticed the security camera above the donation terminal quietly recording everything that had just happened. The following weeks settled into a comfortable rhythm that almost convinced Ethan nothing unusual had happened. His shifts began before sunrise and often ended long after the evening transport lanes glittered outside the hospital windows. Patients arrived from distant colonies carrying unfamiliar accents and unfamiliar illnesses, yet the routines remained reassuringly familiar. Morning rounds, medication deliveries, family updates, quiet conversations with frightened children. Every now and then, his hand would brush against the empty pocket where his father's watch had once rested. The absence still felt strange, but never regretful. Some memories no longer needed an object to survive. On Friday afternoon, Ethan was replacing diagnostic scanners in one of the rehabilitation rooms when his supervisor called his name over the internal communication system. "Ethan, could you stop by Administration Conference Room 3 when you finish? They asked for you specifically." He frowned. Employees were rarely invited to administrative meetings unless paperwork had gone missing or schedules needed adjusting. "Did they say why?" he asked. "No idea," his supervisor replied with a shrug. "Probably nothing serious." 20 minutes later, Ethan stood outside a polished glass door overlooking one of the hospital's indoor gardens. The room beyond appeared unusually formal. Two administrators reviewed digital files, while a woman wearing a dark gray security uniform quietly examined several holographic recordings suspended above the conference table. Ethan knocked lightly before stepping inside. "You asked for me?" The oldest administrator smiled politely. "Please, Mr. Carter, have a seat." Ethan did as requested, trying not to overthink the situation. The security officer touched the floating display, freezing a surveillance image above the table. Ethan immediately recognized the hospital lobby. Then he recognized himself. The recording showed him standing at the anonymous donation terminal several nights earlier, carefully completing the payment before walking away without looking back. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "I thought those transactions were anonymous," he said quietly. The security officer nodded. "They are to the recipient. Hospital security footage is archived automatically for legal compliance. Nobody reviewed it until this morning." Ethan looked from one face to another. "Am I in some kind of trouble?" "Quite the opposite," the administrator replied. "We simply hoped you could explain something." Another image appeared beside the first. It displayed the payment amount, the anonymous donor selection, and the rehabilitation authorization immediately activated afterward. Our finance department discovered that someone voluntarily covered the remaining treatment costs for one of our long-term patients. Ethan remained silent. "The interesting part," the administrator continued, "is that the family never requested assistance, never spoke publicly about their financial situation, and never met with charitable organizations. Whoever made this donation had no practical reason to become involved." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "Some people need help before they feel comfortable asking for it." The room became quiet. The security officer studied him with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. "Do you know who the patient is?" Ethan nodded once. "I met her daughter in Corridor C. Only once. That was enough." The administrator folded his hands together. Mr. Carter, are you aware of the Velas family? Ethan smiled faintly, only that they came from an outer colony and that her mother needed treatment. The three officials exchanged brief glances. It was the kind of silent conversation experienced professionals often had without speaking aloud. Finally, the administrator turned back toward Ethan. Then you truly do not know. Ethan blinked. Know what? Before anyone answered, the conference room door slid open with a gentle hiss. A hospital receptionist stepped inside, carrying a secure communication tablet whose surface shimmered with an unmistakable gold authorization seal. Even Ethan recognized that level of encryption. Only interstellar governments and diplomatic councils use communication protocols like that. Excuse me, the receptionist said carefully. Priority transmission from the Velas delegation. They insist on speaking with Mr. Ethan Carter personally. The room fell completely silent. Ethan looked at the glowing emblem on the tablet with quiet confusion. He had expected perhaps a simple thank you message from Lyra, if she somehow discovered the anonymous donation. Instead, every administrator in the room slowly rose to their feet with expressions of unmistakable respect. The security officer took one small step backward, as though instinctively making space for someone far more important than any ordinary hospital visitor. Ethan accepted the tablet without understanding why the atmosphere had changed so suddenly. The golden seal dissolved into countless tiny points of light, and before the transmission even connected, one sentence appeared across the screen in elegant silver letters. Official diplomatic communication from the House of Velas, first royal family of the Celestial Alliance. For several seconds, Ethan simply stared at the glowing message without touching the acceptance icon. The elegant silver lettering shimmered softly above the tablet, reflecting across the polished conference table like moonlight on calm water. Around him, nobody spoke. Even the quiet hum of the ventilation system suddenly seemed louder than before. Finally, Ethan pressed the confirmation symbol. The holographic display expanded into a life-size projection, and Lyra appeared standing in what looked like a sunlit garden filled with white flowering trees, unlike anything found on Earth. She wore the same simple gray jacket he remembered from the hospital corridor, her long white hair resting gently over one shoulder. Nothing about her appearance suggested royalty. If anything, she looked relieved to see a familiar face. "Hello, Ethan," she said with the same soft voice he remembered. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." Ethan smiled despite the room full of administrators watching every word. "You're doing a pretty good job of surprising me." A faint smile reached her eyes. "You have done that to me several times already." She paused before continuing. "First, I need to apologize." Ethan blinked. "For what?" "For allowing you to help me without knowing who I truly was." Ethan shook his head almost immediately. "You never lied to me." Lyra lowered her eyes briefly. "No, but I allowed you to believe I was someone ordinary." Ethan answered with complete sincerity. "I thought you were someone who was worried about her mother." That was enough. The simple response left Lyra silent for a moment. When she looked back toward him, her expression had softened in a way the administrators had clearly never witnessed before. "Our family often travels without official titles," she explained. "My mother believes people should occasionally experience the galaxy without privilege surrounding them. We learn more that way." Ethan nodded slowly. "That sounds reasonable." A quiet laugh escaped her. "Usually it is. Until she became ill." Her smile faded. "The transport malfunction forced us to stop at your hospital unexpectedly. Our diplomatic security team became separated from us during the emergency evacuation. By the time they located us, Mother refused to leave until her treatment was complete." Ethan remembered how frightened Lyra had looked sitting alone beneath the observation window. It suddenly became easier to understand why no security officers or officials had surrounded her. For a brief period, she had simply been another worried daughter, hoping her mother would survive. "The hospital informed us that an anonymous donor extended my mother's rehabilitation program," Lyra continued quietly. "We requested access to the financial records only because we wanted to reimburse whoever had helped us. Ethan smiled awkwardly. I was hoping nobody would find out. Why? She asked gently. Because kindness feels different when it comes with a receipt. The room became completely still again. One administrator slowly lowered his eyes toward the conference table as though the sentence had reached him more deeply than expected. Lyra smiled with unmistakable admiration. That is exactly what Mother said after meeting you. Ethan looked surprised. She knows who I am. She knows everything. Lyra nodded toward someone standing just outside the holographic frame. A graceful woman stepped forward into view. Her porcelain-white skin and calm silver eyes carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to leadership. Yet there was warmth in the gentle smile she offered Ethan. Mr. Carter, she said, my name is Eliana Velas. I owe you both my recovery and an apology. Ethan immediately shook his head. There is nothing to apologize for. There is. She folded her hands gracefully before her. My family has spent generations studying civilizations across the Alliance. We have witnessed generosity offered to titles, wealth, and influence. Very rarely have we witnessed generosity offered to complete strangers with no expectation of recognition. Ethan looked almost embarrassed. It was only a piece of cake and a hospital bill. Lady Eliana smiled knowingly. No, Ethan. It was dignity. You treated my daughter as though she mattered before you believed she could offer you anything in return. That lesson cannot be purchased by any royal treasury. Before Ethan could answer, Lyra reached toward the edge of the holographic image and held up something familiar. It was the small white cardboard cake box, carefully flattened, preserved, and protected inside a transparent display frame. The slightly crooked chocolate stain still marked one corner exactly where Ethan remembered it. I kept it, she said softly, because this was the first birthday I ever celebrated, even though it belonged to someone else. Ethan felt an unexpected tightness in his chest as he looked at the worn cardboard, preserved with the same care most people reserve for priceless treasures. In that moment, he finally understood something his mother had tried to teach him years before. Sometimes the most valuable gift in the room was never the one wrapped in paper. It was the ordinary moment someone else chose never to forget. The call ended, but the conference room remained silent long after the holographic projection dissolved into countless points of light. Ethan slowly lowered the communication tablet onto the table as though he were afraid of disturbing the moment that had just passed. Around him, the administrators exchanged thoughtful glances that carried far more respect than confusion now. Finally, the oldest administrator smiled warmly. Mr. Carter, he said, there are not many people who can surprise an entire royal family with nothing more than kindness. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck with an embarrassed laugh. I was not trying to surprise anyone. We know, the administrator replied. That is precisely why it mattered. The following morning, life inside Starlight Interstellar Medical Center appeared almost unchanged. Patients still arrived through the emergency entrance. Coffee machines still struggled to keep pace with exhausted nurses. Young children still smiled whenever the holographic stars drifted across the pediatric ceiling. Ethan deliberately returned to his normal routine, quietly hoping the unexpected attention would fade as quickly as it had arrived. He preferred delivering medicine over answering questions. He preferred ordinary conversations over official ceremonies. Most of all, he preferred believing that helping someone should never become news. Around 10 o'clock, while organizing rehabilitation equipment, he noticed two young siblings sitting near the therapy gym. Their skin carried a soft lavender tone, and both wore oversized visitor jackets that nearly reached their ankles. The younger child looked anxiously toward a vending machine displaying colorful snacks behind reinforced glass. Ethan walked over with an easy smile. Everything all right? The older sister nodded politely, but hesitated before answering. Our father forgot his payment card in the patient room. My brother wanted something sweet while we wait. Ethan reached into his pocket, purchased 2 fruit pastries from the machine, and handed one to each child. The little boy accepted his with eyes that sparkled brighter than the holographic stars overhead. Thank you, sir. Ethan smiled. You are welcome. The children hurried away, laughing together, leaving only the empty vending slot behind. Ethan never noticed another security camera quietly recording the exchange. By lunchtime, a different employee approached him near the staff cafeteria. A respiratory therapist looked exhausted after a double shift, searching every pocket of her uniform before sighing in frustration. "Forgot your lunch?" Ethan asked. She nodded sheepishly. "I left it on my kitchen counter this morning." Without hesitation, Ethan split his own sandwich in half and placed one portion onto a napkin before handing it over. "Half tastes better than none." She laughed. "Then what about you?" Ethan shrugged. "I had birthday cake a few days ago. I'm still living off the happiness." The therapist smiled as though she understood the joke far better than he realized. Throughout the afternoon, similar moments unfolded almost naturally. Ethan helped an elderly visitor recharge a translation device. He carried flowers for a woman whose hands were full of medical forms. He paused to explain the hospital map to a frightened family who had just arrived from another colony. None of the gestures required more than a minute or two. None cost very much. Most would probably be forgotten before the day ended. Ethan certainly forgot about them. Someone else did not. Hidden within the hospital's integrated security network, dozens of ordinary moments quietly accumulated into something extraordinary. Not because the actions themselves were dramatic, but because they happened whether anyone was watching or not. That evening, deep inside the diplomatic residence temporarily occupied by the House of Valus, Lyra sat beside her recovering mother in a peaceful garden illuminated by soft lanterns floating above a reflecting pool. A holographic screen projected silent security footage gathered with hospital permission after Ethan's identity had been confirmed. They watched him buying pastries for children, sharing his lunch, helping strangers find the correct hallway, smiling at maintenance workers, thanking custodians, greeting receptionists by name. The recordings continued for nearly 40 minutes. Not once did Ethan glance toward camera. Not once did he expect recognition. When the final recording faded away, Lady Eliana slowly closed the display. "Do you see it now?" she asked quietly. Lyra nodded without taking her eyes from the darkened screen. "Yes. What do you see?" Lady Eliana smiled gently. Lyra answered almost in a whisper. "He does not perform kindness." She looked toward the evening sky where distant stars shimmered beyond the garden dome. "He simply does not know how to be any other way." 3 days later, Starlight Interstellar Medical Center received a visitor unlike any in its history. It began quietly. The morning sky outside the orbital station filled with elegant silver vessels gliding into formation without sirens or military displays. Their polished hulls reflected the sunlight like drifting mirrors, while docking control announced the arrival of an official diplomatic delegation from the Celestial Alliance. Hospital employees gathered near observation windows, whispering to one another as transportation corridors were temporarily cleared. Ethan barely noticed. He was helping an elderly patient adjust a mobility brace, patiently tightening the final clasp before wishing the man a comfortable afternoon. By the time he returned the equipment to storage, his supervisor hurried toward him with an expression somewhere between disbelief and panic. "Ethan," she said, trying to catch her breath, "there is a delegation asking for you." He blinked. "For me?" "The entire executive board is waiting in the main atrium." Ethan looked down at his uniform. One sleeve carried a faint coffee stain from breakfast. His employee badge hung slightly crooked after a busy morning. "I should probably change first." His supervisor smiled despite herself. "I do not think they care." The main atrium had never felt so quiet. Sunlight poured through the enormous glass ceiling, casting warm reflections across marble floors usually crowded with visitors. Today, those same floors stood lined with physicians, nurses, technicians, maintenance workers, volunteers, and patients who had quietly gathered after hearing rumors of the unexpected arrival. At the center of the room stood Lady Eliana and Lyra. Both wore elegant white ceremonial clothing trimmed with silver embroidery, yet neither appeared distant. Lyra smiled the moment she saw Ethan walking through the crowd exactly as she had smiled beside the observation window days earlier. He stopped several feet away, looking slightly uncomfortable with so many eyes upon him. "I hope nobody is sick," he said gently. Lyra laughed softly. "Today is a much happier visit." Lady Eliana stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, our family came to thank you in person." Ethan shook his head almost immediately. "You already did." "Not completely," she replied. A member of the diplomatic staff approached carrying a beautifully crafted crystal case. Inside rested an official medallion bearing the seal of the Celestial Alliance beside documents printed on shimmering silver parchment. Murmurs spread through the atrium. Even hospital administrators recognized the emblem. Lady Eliana accepted the case, but did not open it immediately. Instead, she looked toward Ethan with calm sincerity. "According to the laws of our alliance, any individual whose actions significantly strengthen peaceful relations between civilizations may receive our highest civilian honor." Ethan looked genuinely confused. "I do not think giving someone cake qualifies." Gentle laughter spread through the room. Lady Eliana smiled. "Neither did our counsel." She paused before continuing, until they watched the recordings. Large holographic displays slowly illuminated above the atrium. One by one, ordinary moments appeared across the floating screens. Ethan sharing his birthday cake, buying pastries for 2 children, splitting his lunch, helping visitors read hospital maps, greeting custodians with the same respect he offered physicians, standing anonymously before the donation terminal. Hundreds of employees watched in complete silence. Ethan lowered his eyes, almost embarrassed. "Those were just normal things," he said quietly. Lyra answered before anyone else could. "Perhaps on Earth they are." She stepped closer. "Across much of the galaxy, they are not." The holograms faded, leaving only sunlight streaming through the glass ceiling once again. Lady Eliana finally opened the crystal case before gently closing it again without removing the metal inside. "There is one condition attached to this award," she said. Ethan looked surprised. "What condition?" "You must accept a financial endowment equal to 10 million Alliance credits." Ethan's expression changed immediately. He took one respectful step backward. "Then I cannot accept it." The room fell completely silent. Lady Eliana tilted her head slightly. "May I ask why?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Because I did not help your family hoping to become wealthy. The endowment is intended as gratitude." Ethan smiled warmly. "Then let me ask for something else instead." Every eye in the atrium focused on him. He looked around the hospital that had quietly become his second home, at the nurses who skipped meals during busy shifts, at children waiting beside treatment rooms, at worried parents holding each other's hands, and finally back toward Lady Eliana. "If your family truly wishes to thank me," he said softly, "build more hospitals where families cannot afford them. Give more children a chance to go home healthy. That would be the best birthday present anyone could ever give me." No one spoke. For several long seconds, the only sound inside the vast atrium was the gentle humming of the building itself. Then Lyra smiled through eyes shining with quiet emotion, and Lady Eliana slowly placed the unopened crystal case back into the hands of her diplomatic officer, understanding that the greatest gift in the room had never been something Ethan was willing to keep for himself. 1 year passed almost unnoticed. Seasons changed across Earth. New colonies joined the Alliance, and Starlight Interstellar Medical Center continued welcoming strangers who arrived carrying hope, fear, and quiet prayers in 100 different languages. Ethan Carter remained exactly where he wanted to be. He never accepted promotions that would keep him behind a desk. He still walked the same hallways every morning with a cup of coffee in one hand and patient charts in the other. He still greeted maintenance workers before executives. He still remembered children's names long after they returned home. Most people outside the hospital never recognized him. He preferred it that way. Yet something remarkable had quietly spread far beyond those familiar corridors. The Celestial Alliance fulfilled every request Ethan had made. Instead of transferring millions of credits into his account, Lady Eliana authorized the construction of pediatric medical centers throughout remote frontier systems where advanced treatment had once been impossible to reach. Every new facility carried no statues, no portraits, and no mention of Ethan's name. At the entrance of each hospital stood only a simple inscription chosen by Lyra herself. Kindness is the first medicine every heart understands. The phrase was translated into more than 400 languages and slowly became one of the most quoted sayings across the Alliance. Then Ethan's birthday arrived again. His overnight shift ended just after sunrise. He smiled when the familiar vending machine wished him a happy birthday with the same cheerful synthetic voice it had used the previous year. This time he laughed and bought another small slice of chocolate cake without thinking much about it. Some traditions, even quiet ones, deserve another chance. As he walked toward Corridor C, memories returned almost effortlessly. The polished floor, the observation window, the holographic stars drifting overhead. Everything looked almost exactly the same. Only one thing was different. Someone was already waiting on the bench beneath the window. Lyra stood as soon as she saw him. She was dressed simply once again in a light gray jacket instead of royal ceremonial clothing. Her long white hair caught the soft morning light exactly as it had the night they first met. In her hands rested a small white cardboard box tied with a blue ribbon. Ethan stopped a few feet away and smiled. "You remembered." Lyra smiled back. "How could I forget the first birthday I ever celebrated?" She held out the box. Ethan accepted it carefully before lifting the lid. Inside rested another slice of chocolate cake with a single unlit candle resting beside it. The frosting had been intentionally swirled into the same, slightly crooked shape as the one from a year before. Even a tiny chocolate stain on one corner of the box had been painted there by hand. Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head in amazement. "You recreated the whole thing." "Not everything," Lyra answered gently. She looked toward the empty space beside him on the bench. "Last year, someone chose to sit with a stranger." Ethan understood immediately. Without another word, he sat down beside her exactly where she had been sitting 12 months earlier. Together they looked through the enormous observation window as Earth slowly turned beneath the morning sunlight. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt familiar, peaceful, like an old friendship that had never needed many words. Ethan finally picked up the small plastic fork and carefully divided the cake into 2 equal pieces. He handed one half to Lyra with the same easy smile she had never forgotten. She accepted it with quiet gratitude. "Do humans always divide birthday cake this way?" she asked softly. Ethan looked at the 2 matching pieces resting side by side. "Not always." "Then why today?" He glanced toward the stars fading beyond the brightening sky. "Because some birthdays remind us that getting older is not the most important thing that happens." Lyra nodded slowly, as though she had finally found the answer she had been searching for ever since that first night in the corridor. Around them, hospital life continued exactly as always had. Nurses hurried between patient rooms. Children laughed somewhere beyond the therapy wing. Elevators opened and closed with gentle mechanical chimes. Nobody paid much attention to 2 friends quietly sharing cake beside a window. And perhaps that was the most beautiful part of all. The galaxy would remember treaties, hospitals, and diplomatic history. Ethan would remember a stranger sitting alone beneath cold white lights. Lyra would remember that one ordinary slice of cake could become the beginning of a different life. Sometimes the greatest stories in the universe never begin with heroes. Sometimes they begin with someone who simply notices another person crying and decides that no one should have to face the stars alone.